ready to dive deep into I Great Chronicles. It's one of those books that people often kind of skim over,
Mm.
but we're going to really unpack it. See if we can find some of those hidden gems that maybe you wouldn't notice on a first read.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get bogged down in all the names and dates, but there's so much richness there, when you look closely.
Totally. And we're focusing on a few key areas today. First off, those genealogies at the beginning. I'll admit they can seem a little dry at first glance, but I think you have a perspective that makes them a lot more interesting.
Well, yeah, the key is understanding how they thought about family back then. The word sons doesn't always mean literal sons, right? It's often more about descendants or even clan leaders.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's more like a map of who's connected to who and who holds the power within those family lines.
Exactly. It's about tracing lineage and authority through generations.
So it's not just a family tree, it's like a social and political map of the ancient world,
Yeah.
which suddenly makes those lists a lot more intriguing.
Right. And you see how those genealogies actually connect to some pretty big historical events. Like, for example, you have the origins of nations like Egypt and the Philistines woven into those lineages.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about individuals, it's about tracing the roots of entire civilizations.
Exactly. You see how all these different groups are related, how their histories intertwine. It gives you a whole new perspective on those familiar names from history class.
Yeah, it makes you realize it's not just isolated events, it's all connected somehow.
And what's also cool is alongside these sweeping historical narratives, you have these little personal stories tucked into those genealogies, like the prayer of Jabez.
Oh yeah, Jabez. Just a quick mention, but his prayer is so powerful.
Right. It shows that even amidst all these big names and events, individuals still had a direct connection with God. They had their own hopes and struggles.
Makes you realize these aren't just names on a page, these are real people.
Exactly. And speaking of real people making real choices, you have the story of Reuben loses his birthright because of his actions.
Yeah, a reminder that choices have consequences, even for those in positions of power.
For sure. And then we move into the reign of King David. Now, Chronicles really focuses on his leadership, particularly from I guess you could say, a religious perspective.
Yeah, definitely. It highlights his military victories, but it always ties them back to his relationship with God.
It emphasizes that David's success isn't just about his own strength or strategy, it's because God is with him.
Like all those epic battles, conquering the Philistines, the Moabites, even the Syrians. It's exciting stuff, but the narrative makes it clear that it's God who's giving him the victory.
Yeah, it's not just a warrior king. It's like he's an instrument of God's power. And you see that in the way he conquers Jerusalem, which was then called Judas.
Oh yeah, Jerusalem. He saw the potential of that city, made it his capital.
Right. And he brings the Ark of the Covenant into the city.
Can you imagine that procession? Bringing the ark into Jerusalem with David leading the way, dancing and singing praises to God.
Oh, it must have been an incredible sight.
Talk about a leader who knew how to inspire his people. It wasn't just about military power. It was about celebrating their faith together.
Absolutely. And you see that also in the way he organizes the Levites, sets up this massive choir and orchestra with 4,000 musicians.
4,000 musicians,
Ah.
wow. Playing cymbals, lyres, harps, all kinds of instruments.
It's like he created this national soundtrack of worship and praise.
That's amazing. It shows how important music and worship were to him.
Right. It wasn't just about outward show. It was a reflection of his deep personal devotion to God.
And we see that reflected in the Psalms too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Those Psalms give us a glimpse into his heart, his relationship with God.
So we've got this picture of David, the warrior king, the
Yeah.
spiritual leader, the musician. But then we come to this episode that's a little more complicated, the census.
Yeah, the census.
On the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, but things go wrong pretty quickly.
It wasn't necessarily wrong to take a census, but it represented a shift in David's perspective. He started relying more on his own calculations and military might, and less on God.
Almost like he was putting his trust in numbers instead of in God's provision.
Exactly. And of course, we see the consequences of that.
And it's interesting how that episode is portrayed a little differently in Samuel and Chronicles.
Yeah, good point. Samuel focuses more on God's anger with Israel. Chronicles suggests that Satan might have been involved, inciting David to take the census.
So it's the same event, but different perspectives, different theological lenses, if you will.
Absolutely. It shows us that there can be multiple layers of meaning to these stories.
Like we're piecing together a puzzle, trying to understand all the different angles.
Exactly. And ultimately, even though it's a difficult episode, the census story shows us that David ultimately recognized his mistake, repented, and submitted to God's judgment.
It's a reminder that even the greatest leaders are human. They make mistakes. It's how they respond that really matters.
Exactly. And that's a key theme throughout Chronicles, this idea of human fallibility alongside God's faithfulness.
So we've seen David's triumphs, his struggles, his deep devotion. But there's one big dream that he doesn't get to fulfill in his lifetime: building the temple.
Yeah, the temple. That's a whole other layer to this story, and it's where we'll pick up next time. So last time we were talking about David and, how much he wanted to build that temple for God. But that wasn't part of God's plan for him, was it?
Right. He really wanted to build it himself. But it's interesting how Chronicles portrays that whole situation.
Yeah.
You'd think there'd be some drama, like David feeling disappointed or even resentful that he couldn't build this grand temple.
Right.
But it's not like that at all. It focuses more on how he accepts God's plan, like he understood there was a bigger picture.
It's one of those things that makes David so compelling as a leader. Yeah, he was ambitious and powerful. He accomplished some incredible things, but he never let his ego get in the way of what God wanted.
Right. He knew his place.
Yeah. And so even though he wasn't allowed to build the temple, he poured his heart and soul into preparing for it.
Oh, yeah. He went all in on the preparations, gathering materials, organizing the Levites, even drawing up detailed plans for Solomon to follow.
Right. He was laying the foundation even though he knew he wouldn't see the finished product.
It's kind of like planting a seed knowing that it's going to grow into something amazing, even if you're not around to see it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's a reminder that sometimes our biggest impact comes from empowering others to fulfill their potential.
Passing the torch, so to speak.
Exactly. David couldn't build the temple himself, but he made sure Solomon had everything he needed to succeed.
And speaking of passing the torch, that transition from David to Solomon is another moment where Chronicles really shines, I think.
It does. The narrative really captures how momentous this transition was. It wasn't just some behind-the-scenes transfer of power.
Right.
It was a public declaration in front of all the leaders of Israel, this is my heir, this is the guy.
It was a big deal for the entire nation.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the politics. David gives Solomon all this advice, urges him to be faithful to God, to seek wisdom, to follow God's commands.
It's like a father passing on his most cherished values to his son.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture of what leadership should be about. It's not just about having authority, it's about serving something greater than yourself.
And the people were totally on board with this new era. Chronicles describes how they all brought offerings for the temple: gold, silver, timber, precious stones.
Like a massive outpouring of support,
Totally. They were invested in this project, excited to see what Solomon would do.
I think it shows how much the temple meant to them. Not just as a building, but as a symbol of God's presence among them.
Right, a place where they could connect with God, worship him, experience his power. And in the midst of all this preparation, David offers this powerful prayer.
Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful prayer. Really captures his humility and gratitude.
He knew that ultimately all the power and glory belonged to God.
Exactly. He saw himself as an instrument in God's hands.
So David departs, leaving this amazing legacy. And Solomon steps up, ready to build the temple, start a new chapter for Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you read the description of the temple in Chronicles, it's clear that Solomon spared no expense.
Oh, yeah, they went all out.
Gold-covered walls, intricate carvings, these massive bronze pillars.
It was meant to be awe-inspiring, a testament to God's glory and Solomon's wisdom.
And it wasn't just about the outward appearance either. It was designed to be a dwelling place for God, a place where people could experience his presence in a tangible way.
It was the heart of their religious and national identity.
A physical representation of their covenant relationship with God. And the dedication to the temple, as it's described in Chronicles, it's this incredible moment. Solomon gathers all the people, offers sacrifices, prays this beautiful prayer, asking for God's blessing.
Yeah, it's a powerful scene, a real culmination of everything they'd been working towards.
But even in that moment of triumph, you kind of sense this hint of foreshadowing. Like, okay, this is amazing, but what's going to happen next?
Yeah, Solomon, despite all his wisdom, eventually strayed from God's path, led the kingdom into idolatry and division.
Right. It's a reminder that even the most promising beginnings can go astray.
And it kind of sets the stage for the rest of Chronicles, which traces the ups and downs of the kings who followed Solomon.
Some who honored God and some who, didn't.
Exactly. It's a story of faithfulness and failure, obedience and rebellion.
A story that, in many ways, continues to play out in our own lives today. So we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Chronicles. It's amazing how much there is to uncover in this book, right? You think it's just going to be a dry rehashing of stuff we already read in Kings.
Yeah, you kind of go in with low expectations, Like, oh, more genealogies, great.
Right. But then you start noticing all these little details, these different perspectives,
Yeah.
and you realize it's telling the story in a whole new way.
It's like those optical illusions where you see one thing and then you shift your perspective and it's something completely different.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. And one of the things that really stood out to me as we've been talking is this theme of preparation.
Oh, yeah, preparation.
Yeah, like with David, right? He couldn't build a temple himself, but he spends years and years getting everything ready.
Right, gathering all the materials, organizing the Levites, even drawing up the blueprints.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, okay, this is so important that I'm going to pour everything I have into making sure it happens, even if I'm not the one who gets to see it completed.
And I think that's a challenge for us, Are we willing to invest in things that might not benefit us directly?
Right. Are we building for the future, even if we might not be around to see the results?
It's like planting a tree knowing that it's going to provide shade for generations to come.
And speaking of things that have a long-lasting impact, we can't forget about the Davidic covenant. That promise that God made to David, that his dynasty would last forever.
Yeah, the Davidic covenant. It's a huge theme in Chronicles. It's like the backbone of the whole story,
Right. It's not just about David and Solomon. It points towards something much bigger, something that's still unfolding today.
It's that thread of hope that runs through the whole book, even when you see kings messing up, making bad choices.
Right. Even when things are falling apart, there's still this underlying sense that God is working out his plan.
And that plan ultimately leads to Jesus, the descendant of David, who came to establish a kingdom that will never end.
So it's like Chronicles is giving us this sneak peek, this glimpse of God's ultimate purpose.
Exactly. It's all connected.
So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways you'd want our listeners to walk away with from our deep dive into Chronicles?
Well, I think first and foremost, Chronicles challenges us to see history differently. It's not just a bunch of facts and figures. It's a story full of drama and intrigue. And most importantly, it's a story about God's interaction with humanity.
Right, it's his story.
And I think it also reminds us that leadership isn't just about power or position.
Yeah.
It's about character, integrity, serving something bigger than yourself. And like we were talking about before, it's about preparing the way for others to succeed.
Yeah, leaving a legacy.
Exactly. And finally, I think Chronicles offers us a message of hope. Even in the midst of all the messiness of human history, there's this unshakable sense that God is in control.
That he has a plan and he's working it out.
Yeah, and we can trust him, even when we don't understand everything that's going on.
So to our listeners out there, if you're feeling intimidated by Chronicles, don't be. Dive in, ask questions, and see what you discover.
You might be surprised at how relevant and inspiring this ancient book can be for us today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.